It's very flattering to have one's own article title used as the title of a conference. This has never happened to me before, especially an article that actually got me in a lot of trouble. It made me about as many friends as it made me enemies. And so I couldn't resist the invitation to come here and defend that title, as it were. Before I begin, I do want to remember, as we did this morning, Thomas Bezetsky, who passed away recently. Thomas was, as we mentioned this morning, a Amphora specialist. He was from Hungary originally. He immigrated to Austria. But he really exemplified, I think, the struggles that people have to go through from any background to survive in this field. I think particularly in Europe, I mean, he had to hustle. He had to really keep at it and constantly apply for grants and contracts. And he did really exemplify, as I say, the kind of perseverance that is required, I think, sometimes to make an impact in the field, which he did. His impact, I think, will be felt for a very long time. And I'm very proud to consider him my friend. I want to start by going back to the early 2000s and the late 1990s. As some of you remember, some of you don't. We all thought, as the calendar ticked over to January 1st, 2000, that we'd all die. We thought airplanes were going to fall out of the sky. Our computers would surely all crash, except for Macs, which is why I use one. And we were also convinced as academics that all of our student records would be wiped out. This gave great hope to some students, but it never came to pass. It led, though, to much soul-searching in a strange way. I think everybody in every field suddenly had to talk about what was going to happen in their field in the next millennium. And I did the same thing. In the 1998 Amsterdam IAC conference, I gave a paper on the future of Amphora studies. And then there came my review article again of Amphoras in the 1990s. So it seems, I think, appropriate for us now with the 2018 Cologne and Bonn International Congress of Classical Archaeology behind us to kind of return to this Y2K midlife crisis that I experienced. My paper has two very basic parts, the past and the present or future. In large part, the section on the past is meant to explain, in a way, my frustration that led to that review article. That review article was, it was obviously a diatribe in some ways. I reread it. I don't tend to reread what I write, but I reread it a few weeks ago before coming here. And I thought, well, that doesn't sound too angry. But I certainly remember writing it thinking, you know, rage against the machine kind of thing. And it really, it was meant to be a sort of anti-establishment call to arms. I was younger and had more hair then. I'm going to go back to, definitely not the beginning of Amphora studies, but I want to highlight sort of the main link I had to the early days of Amphora studies, and that was Virginia Grace, who I met first in 1992, only 2 years before she passed away in 1994, at the age of 94. And she did actually tell me as I was defining my dissertation topic, and I broke the news to her that I was only going to focus on the 5th century BC, she told me, why? Why not do all of it? Life is long, she said. I thought, yeah, for you. But I want to get my PhD before I'm 90. Virginia Grace was born, as I say, in 1901. She first came to Greece as a graduate student in 1927. Her Bryn Mawr dissertation was on the amphora stamps from the Athenian Agora excavated between 1931 and 1933, and that was published in 1934 as a very long article in Hesperia. During the 1930s, Virginia Grace worked at various sites around the Aegean, including Pergamon, as well as Halai and Tarsus. During the Second World War, as some of you may know, she worked first in Cairo and then in Izmir with the American Office of Strategic Services, which would later become the CIA. But back then it was involved more in the war effort, less in installing democracies around the world or dictators, whatever. But her best known work, and actually she was most prolific after that period, so from basically the late 40s into the basically mid 80s or even early 90s. This was the time period when she did a huge amount of work documenting the amphoras on the island of Rhodes. She and her colleagues cataloged the collections of the National Museum in Athens. This involved finding a cache of hand grenades, live hand grenades, under a pile of amphoras in the courtyard of the National Museum, stashed there during the Civil War. And she also, during this time, she essentially established the team that you see in the lower right, of colleagues who worked with her to document basically all known amphoras, and especially amphora stamps found around the Mediterranean world. And she created in this way a massive card file that is essentially the first database, as it were, for amphora studies, all on these sort of 3 by, not even 5-inch cards. They're smaller. They're sort of half cards to save time and space, or money and space. They're these tiny little cards that she would pack with information. That card file was then converted into an electronic database starting in the early 1990s under the aegis of what was called then the Amphora project, which existed on an early database platform, totally homemade, essentially, and very, very little of that ever became public. So there's a huge amount of legacy data that someday might come online. Virginia Grace's work specifically on the amphoras of Asia Minor, and I'll come back with each of these sort of historiographic points. I'm going to come back to the question of Asia Minor. Of course, most of her work was dominated by the big 3, Rhodes, Knidos, and Kos. Her work on Cnidian amphoras is probably her most extensive, though definitely not her most extensive in terms of publication, but in terms of her work, this is what she really devoted a lot of effort to. Unfortunately, apart from her work on the Middle Stoa building fill in 1985, very little of that work ever came to fruition, ever came to publication. In terms of work in on amphoras of Asia Minor, though, she also is very important for her definition, her early definition of Samian amphoras, as well as her definition of the so-called Nicandros group, which later I've argued, and others, Thomas Bezetsky as well, has argued should be attributed to Ephesus. She also identified a jar type that I simply referred to as a mushroom-rimmed jar, a classical amphora type that she wondered if it was Attic. And so on all her documentation, she writes Attic ? With this amphora type that you see just in front of the Panathenaic jar. The reason I have the Panathenaic jar there is that part of her argument for these being Attic was their similarity to Panathenaic amphoras. And in my thesis and elsewhere, I've sort of shied away from that argument. I don't really find it very convincing. And as I'll talk about later, it's been shown quite clearly that these amphoras are from, in fact, Asia Minor, southern Asia Minor. Throughout the 20th century, and in fact much earlier as well, there was a huge amount of work being done by scholars, first in Tsarist Russia, and then, of course, in the Soviet period and continuing in the post-Soviet period. The names I show here on the slide, Grakov, Zayst, and Brzezinski, are just three of the sort of major figures, with Iraida Zayst being somebody who published one of the dominant typologies for classical and Hellenistic amphoras that came out in 1960. Pontic scholarship tended to, certainly they paid attention to amphora stamps, but far more so than in the Aegean, they paid very close attention to all amphoras. They certainly saw these as evidence for economic practices, and therefore they were, of general interest to, somebody working under a communist regime. So there was always this interest there. And one thing that, in fact, Iraida Zayst did before Virginia Grace even thought about this, though Grace and Zayst were very familiar with one another's work, Zayst did define a different type of amphora as Samian, and these are on the left-hand side of the slide here. In the upper, on the left-hand side, in the upper part, you see this is the so-called Samian type for Zayst. And then below that is what she called Proto-Thasian. And as you see, they're very similar in shape. And this has caused, as we'll see, no end of scholarly difficulties. Other types that they defined was the Solokha type 1, named for a tumulus in southern Russia, where they're found. And this basically corresponds with that mushroom rim type I was referring to earlier. And this type developed into what was then referred to as the Ust-Lapinskoy type, again named after the site where some of these were found. Virginia Grace herself, jumping back to the sort of Western world, or the Aegean world at any rate, Virginia Grace herself never had official students. She never held a teaching position. But she had a number of very dear colleagues, younger colleagues whom she mentored through various projects. For our purposes, I give you the names there of Carolyn Kaler and Barbara Klinkenbeard as two examples. But in terms of the southern Aegean, the coast of Asia Minor, the most important is actually Elizabeth Lyding Will, who is best known for her work on Roman period amphoras in the Western Mediterranean. But in the 1950s, Will wrote a manuscript of Latin stamps in the Aegean. And so so she was interested in Aegean material, and in 1982, Will published a very influential article on Greco-Italic amphoras, where she linked Western Mediterranean amphora types with this mushroom-rimmed Aegean type that I've been talking about. And what that did was it was widely accepted, and it ended up with the result that workers in the Aegean, scholars in the Aegean, started labeling all these amphoras as Greco-Italic, with the implication that they were somehow Italian, Western imports. And what that then did was, in fact, obscure the real record that's really quite interesting of Italian imports in the Aegean. So this typological label, in fact, has had wide-ranging influence. Another scholar, we're kind of in the early 1980s, mid-1980s here. Another scholar has been very influential on the amphoras of Asia Minor, particularly in the Archaic period, is Pierre Dupont. And his early period of work was really around 1982 to 85, where he started to refine some of Grace's and Zayst's typological labels. Perhaps most influentially, he identified Milesian production through scientific analysis of the fabrics to distinguish Milesian from Samian. He was able to make that distinction. I'm going to highlight two conferences in the course of this lecture this evening. And the first is a conference held in 1984 in Athens, published in 1986 as BCH Supplement 13. This is, of all the BCH supplements in the American School Library in Athens, this one is the one that is in worst condition. From people over the years, photocopying it, looking at it, I think being very frustrated by it, throwing it around. The pages are falling out. It's a disaster. And yet it's also one of the few supplements that is not available online. As far as if someone has a PDF of it, let me know. But anyways, this was it was a conference that largely focused on Amphora stamps, and I've given you a kind of breakdown of the topics here. That's the graph you see there is the topics by geography. And you'll notice that Thasos and Rhodes play the dominant role in terms of the articles here. For Thasos, most of the attention was paid by Yvan Garland and his colleagues on the workshop sites. For Rhodes, most of the attention was from Jean-Yves Amphoras, and more to do, again, somewhat with workshop sites, but also the stamps themselves, possibilities of databases, for example, of the Rhodian stamps. So this was the clear focus of this volume was really very much on stamped amphoras. The volume did make a few what I would consider key moves in terms of the study of amphoras in Asia Minor, though. One of the key moves here was Amphora's one-sentence comment that he thought that amphoras with a mushroom rim formed a sort of koine of Asia Minor. And this is a phrase that I then ran with throughout my entire career. Another aspect of the work in BCH Supplement 13 was the typological work, or the discussion by Ersin Doer on his excavations at Kladsamenai. Again, where he had kiln material, where he knew what local production would look like, and that was one of the few articles in this collection that actually illustrates amphoras as opposed to stamps. So that was another significant highlight. There were two German participants in the conference, Christoph Berker and Gerhard Jorens, and their contributions as well highlighted certain aspects of identification of the Prow stamped amphoras, and Gerhard Jorens' contribution focused on finds from the island of Samos. But one thing that despite its popularity, shall we say, in the libraries in Athens, one thing that this volume does not do is help you if you are a young student trying to learn about amphoras. And this is why I say it's probably been thrown across many rooms out of pure frustration. Yvan Garland is certainly another one of these sort of giants of the field. Most all of his work has dealt with Thasos in the North Aegean and into the Black Sea region. I want to highlight his work here, though, in the sense that he did give us a kind of roadmap for attention to workshops, attention to how the study of workshop deposits can affect the study of stamps and our analysis and interpretation of those stamps. And in this regard, his work is really of undeniable value. Now, he was also a person who, after Amphoras in Need of Archaeology appeared, wrote me a 2-page letter telling me what a horrible person I was. So I've been scarred for life after that. Garland, though, also forms a very important connection beyond the Iron Curtain, because his wife, although she has no ancestry, shall we say, in Russia, she self-trained herself to read Russian so that she could translate articles for her husband. I thought, wow, I won't say anything more. At any rate, Garland became this kind of conduit for Pontic literature to come into Western knowledge. The night before I wrote my PhD exams in Greek, Roman, and Near Eastern archaeology and history, news of the Berlin Wall's destruction came on the television. We had televisions then. And one of my roommates, I lived in a house filled with archaeologists. I think there were 6 of us, all in the same program, all taking exams the next day. Half of us kept studying. I kept studying. One of my roommates was glued to the TV, and he came into the exams the next morning and said, "How can you possibly expect us to write these exams? The Berlin Wall just came down. This is a historic moment. We had to watch it." And I sort of thought, I have to pass my exams. It will still be down, I assumed, long after. And I was right. I passed my exams. So did he, actually. They weren't that bad. The collapse of the wall, though, I mean, it obviously had a huge impact in all aspects of life, but in terms of classical studies, I would say that very few fields benefited more from that event than Amphora studies. Amphora studies were really revolutionized by that event. It wasn't immediate, but over the course of the next decade, we became a kind of unified scholarly community that wouldn't, obviously could not have happened were it not for events here in this city. In the early 1990s, there was an interesting kind of uptick in attention to Amphora profiles and publication from Aegean sites. And this is, I think I was very fortunate to come into the field when I did, because I could I had reference to a few articles from the 1980s that published amphoras. But right around the same time I was starting my work, Alan Johnston published the material from Aegina, which included numerous profile drawings. Francine Blondet and her colleagues published a massive article on finds from a mid-4th century well at Thasos, and Yves Grandjean published a similarly massive article on finds from the Silene Gate at Thasos. And this was bearing in mind that before this we had about 3 articles that were not in Russian that allowed us to think about amphoras. We now had 100% more material, if not more so. And so this was again, a very important moment. It was also important, though, for how we thought about amphoras, and this comes back to Asia Minor. One of the things that Alan Johnston said in his article was that he thought that there were certain amphoras that were from the region of Miletus. He didn't say they were from Miletus. He said, well, they're from around Miletus somewhere. Virginia Grace fired off this note to him that I've seen, where she said, how can something be from the region of Miletus? It's either Milesian or it's not Milesian. Because she was fixed on the idea that each amphora should belong to a given city. And Johnston was starting to kind of tweak at that idea, continuing to kind of undermine this established notion. And again, this is something that I really focused on myself then as I started my dissertation research in the fall of 1992. My initial idea with the dissertation was that I was going to compare Athens and Corinth, the 2 American projects in Greece. It should have been easy. In fact, the amphora records from the 2 sites cannot be more different. They're different types of deposits, they're different materials, everything was different. So I ended up sticking with Athens, and I had plenty to work with there. I had 2 choices to make, or not to make, but I could focus either primarily on quantities, quantified data, or I could look at what I think of as more qualitative data, the kind of nature of the amphoras themselves. I quickly realized that the quantitative data was problematic because of so much discard over the years. But what I did find, despite that sort of editing of the material, is that I could in fact classify deposits using the numbers of different types as their characteristics and mathematically, in fact, classify them, group them chronologically. And so I used the characteristics of the deposits to actually classify my deposits chronologically. But I was in a way much more interested in the qualitative side. There had been a tradition in Athens and in the Aegean generally of focus on the Athenian standards decree of the mid-5th century as a way to kind of think about the importance of amphoras themselves as sort of carriers of information, of economic mechanisms. And I really ran with this, and part of this was was the fact that I'd also taken a lot of anthropology and economic anthropology courses that focused very much on how transactions happen and less on the numbers of amphoras being traded at any one time. At the same time, as I was working on my dissertation, Ian Whitbread was laboriously revising his dissertation, and thankfully his dissertation was already on file at the British School, so I could use it. But this was then, Ian Whitbread's book was the first book on amphoras to come out around the time I was working on my dissertation, and really the first substantial book on amphoras in the Western world. Virginia Grace had written a little tiny paperback on amphoras in the wine trade. There was no book on amphoras until Ian's book came out. The other thing about Ian's work was that it gave us all a very clear kind of structure for thinking about amphoras and fabric analysis, because he brought to the field a very specific question. Could petrography differentiate between and identify between stamp types? That is, we knew where the amphoras were from. Could petrography actually make the same distinctions that we already knew? So he approached this with a very rigorous hypothetical approach. And the message, I think, was clear that before we just go cutting up amphoras or bombarding them with neutrons or whatever, we need to have questions, and we need to have a sort of research framework based on archaeology. And so this is, I think, really a significant point in terms of the development of the field. In around 1996 and 1997, I started working mostly in Asia Minor for a while. I was initially invited by Keith DeVries from the University of Pennsylvania to work at Gordion, and the first summer I was there, I also had arranged to work at Ephesus, so I took an overnight bus one day to Ephesus. Then I took another bus back to Gordion after I'd done a little time at Ephesus, and I arrived at Gordion to a phone call from Troy saying, we've got a lot of amphoras here, why don't you come out here? So I got on the bus again and went up to Troy, and then went back to Gordion and almost swore off Turkish buses after that. But what it meant was, well, it actually spawned a number of very, I think, useful research exercises for me. One point that emerged out of that work was the real importance of local chronologies, of local history being used to define the archaeological chronology. What that meant was that, for example, at Troy, we didn't have to depend on the Athenian Agora's chronology for our fine wares, for example. We didn't have to depend on even that much on amphora stamps for our chronology, because we had fixed points, and we carefully selected the deposits to publish that would exploit those fixed points. So that was one thing that emerged out of this work. And the same is true actually at Ephesus, where the city was moved in the early Hellenistic period, and we know roughly when it was moved. There's debate about the precise year. But we had some historical fixed points to work with. Another aspect of this work was the recognition of local amphora types that I could be 99.5% sure were local, simply on the basis of their prevalence at the site. And I know that commentators on this issue would often say, well, amphoras are built for export. Why would they be the dominant type at a site? Surely that's an irrelevant issue. But in fact, that's true, but what I just said is also true. So at Ephesus, for example, a huge proportion of the amphoras in every single box I would look at would be these Nicandros group amphoras. And the same forms appeared in table amphoras, the same fabrics. And so, I would have bet my whole life or whatever on the idea that these were local. And lo and behold, Thomas later showed that they were through various fabric analyses. It was the same at Troy, again, where every box you open, there'd be this dominant type that I had never seen elsewhere in the Aegean. And I thought, well, this is probably local. And again, neutron activation analysis has shown that it probably is. It might not be from the actual site of Troy, but somewhere in the very nearby vicinity. The other aspect that came out of this, especially for Gordion is a very long inland bus ride. I don't remember now, but it was a long, long bus ride. And yet, the site is packed with Greek amphoras. So anyone that tells you you can't take amphoras far distant overland is simply wrong. Trust me, they didn't use buses and trucks either. In 1998, I began working on a very large topic project that is still ongoing of publishing the typology of amphoras from the Athenian Agora, dating from the late 6th century to the sack of Sulla, or sack by Sulla in 86. The goal with this was to basically set up the typological framework which people like Ian Whitbread and others could then test through various other methods of analysis. Now, the fact that it's unfinished doesn't really help matters, but the other thing that rapidly became clear was that at this major consumption site, I had little threads. Think of them as like little broken DNA strands or something like that. I had these little segments of typological development. Unlike at a consumption site, I couldn't go from day 1 to day 3,000 with one amphora type and trace it all the way through. I was just doing these little chunks, basically. And so this, for some types, this becomes really quite a difficulty. The other thing I also realized in working on this project was that, well, for one thing, I could redate a lot of buildings around the Agora, which is always fun. But the other aspect of it was that I could start to think about how these amphoras were actually used in the central marketplace of Athens. And so, for example, my work on the southeast corner of the Agora that I've proposed as a sort of wine selling area is based on the fact that there's this immense concentration of commercial graffiti in that region. The real, shall we say, floodgates in terms of scholarship from the Pontic world really occurred in the late 1990s. And a huge force in this area is the work of Sergei Monakhov. I show you some of his publications here. They're actually almost all available online now. What this means is that if you're looking for a kind of entry point into looking at amphoras, profiles of amphoras from all over the Greco-Roman world, or the Greek world, that entry point is now pretty clear, and it's in Russian. So as I say, I mean, if you can at least teach yourself how to pick out dates and how to pick out place names in Russian, you're fine, and you have lots of illustrations to work off of. Monakhov's output has been vast and yet limited. It's limited in the sense that if there are chronological uncertainties and problems in terms of the Aegean types, he rarely has good evidence to sort of contribute back to us. What he has, he's got great evidence for Pontic sites, for Pontic production. But when there are lingering issues of chronology for the Aegean types or identifications, he's in a way, less helpful. One example of where he has not really been able to contribute much is, in fact, in the issue of Rhodian chronology. And he hasn't been able to contribute much simply because trade between the Aegean and the Black Sea really tails off in the 2nd century BC, or even already in the mid-3rd century. So if you want to study Rhodian chronology or Amphoras from Knidos or Kos, the Black Sea doesn't really help so much. One place that, of course, does help very much for issues of Rhodian chronology is Pergamon. And when this volume of the republication of the Pergamon deposit came out in 1998, this was, again, right around the time I was writing the Amphoras in Need article. And I was very much thinking about archaeological context. And so I asked myself, okay, what does this context itself tell us about the date of the material? Because the earlier reports from the late 19th century engaged in this problematic circular reasoning that the deposit should date to around 220 to 180 because this was the period of good relations between Rhodes and Pergamon. But if my question as an economic historian is how do I use amphoras to determine when two cities had good relations, I can't use the Pergamon deposit because its dates are based on the very assumption that or question that I've raised. So I wanted to find some kind of external evidence for the date. And for that purpose, I basically went with a rule of thumb that things fall downhill, rather than uphill. And also, a second rule, I suppose, is that you dump trash in out-of-the-way places. You don't really want to dump your garbage in the front of your house. You might dump it off the backyard somewhere, or in your neighbor's house, but anyways. And so I looked at plans of Pergamon and where the deposit was found, and came to this suggestion that the deposit is the result of dumping from the buildings that preceded Palace 5, were destroyed by the construction of Palace 5, and therefore the date of the construction of Palace 5 should give us the end date or the approximate end date for the Pergamon deposit. And then you say, okay, well, what's the date of Palace 5? And well, it's connected with the Great Altar because there's a few stones from the Great Altar at Palace 5's construction. And so then you say, okay, well, what's the date of the Great Altar? And so you say, okay, it's anywhere from sort of 180 to, or even, I've even seen earlier, down to 160, 150, 140, I mean, who knows? And I basically just went with the arguments that I thought were most reasonable, but I could easily be wrong. But what that did, by my arguing that the Pergamon deposit closes around 160, is that I divorced the Pergamon deposit from questions of Pergamene trade with Rhodes. And then I could argue about the relationship between military political relations and trade. But I had to make that distinction first. Another thing that came up as I was thinking about the Pergamon deposit is that, if this is a cache of amphoras related to storage on the Acropolis, we can't really assume that it represents Pergamene imports writ large. In other words, this could be very preferential ordering. And I look forward very much to further discussion of this deposit tomorrow. We come now to Pierre Dupont's second incarnation in the late 1990s and early 2000s, where he again continued to tease out these problems of Samian versus Milesian versus Northern Ionian, possibly even Thracian, and this spawned a huge amount of work on his part. I come now to the second major conference, and I suddenly thought to myself, was that Athens 2000 or 2002? Okay, good, yeah, okay. Anyways, it was published very quickly in 2004, so it's easy to think, well, really, they did that so quickly. As you see in the comparison on the screen, the blue bars are BCH Supplement 13, and the orange bars represent topics addressed in Athens 2002. In Athens 2002, there was an explicit attention to a much broader Amphora world, that is both geographically as well as chronologically. And so the spread of papers was much broader. There was far less attention to stamps. There was some, but it was not nearly as extensive. And that's particularly clear in this slide. The circled areas are attention to Rhodes and Thasos in particular, and you can see that, again, BCH Supplement 13 really addressed those two, whereas Athens 2002 or 2004, when it was published, there's far less attention to those two aspects. In terms of Asia Minor, in particular, my paper in this venue gave me a chance to talk about the Nicandros group and its chronological development. And here my emphasis was, as has been mentioned earlier today, the emphasis was on stratified sequences. When I first arrived in Ephesus to work particularly on this material, the idea was that we would all collaborate on the study of a dumped fill above all this stratified material. The idea being it had better preserved material, and this was very much in the tradition of classical archaeology of studying big fills, big deposits. And I said, that's crazy. We don't know the date of any of this material. How are we going to sort out what's early Roman from what's late Hellenistic or early Hellenistic in this massive dumped fill? And so we went back, starting from the bottom and going to the top through a fantastic sequence of strata that did, in fact, reveal, I think, a fairly robust chronology that now only needs, I think, fairly minor revisions. The other papers in this collection did also try to sort out this question of mushroom rim amphoras and came to the conclusion that perhaps they were not from one particular city, which I thought, yes, that is absolutely the case. They're from a number of different cities, with the economic implication being that the form of the amphora no longer indicated the brand of a particular city. It may have referred to the contents, the general type of, say, wine or oil present, but it was definitely, in this case at any rate, no longer the specific brand of a specific city. Now, since Athens 2002, there's obviously been a huge amount of further work. I would say in a lot of ways that was an important catalyst almost for encouraging people that amphora studies were important and people should really pay more attention to them. And I just give you here a kind of laundry list of some of the major sites. In addition to amphora studies from these sites, there's also been a number, of course, of further conferences, and I'm just highlighting here a few of the major ones, including the series of production and trade of amphoras in the Black Sea. The 3 volumes of that came out, and I'll just highlight again John London's couple of volumes on various aspects of amphora studies. The other thing that's come out in recent years is greater attention by ancient historians to amphoras. And I think this is a very important development and is really limited, I'd say, to the last decade or so. I illustrate on the slide in the bottom left there, or sorry, bottom right, the recent book, The Ancient Greek Economy, edited by Ed Harris and David Lewis and Mark Woolmer. This has 3 chapters on amphoras in a volume that is, spearheaded by very, very traditional economic historians. So I think this is really a quite major sort of feature of recent studies. So this brings me to kind of the current situation and some of the challenges that I'd like to sort of pose and highlight. Starting with typology, because this is something, this is at the ground level of the kinds of things we're working on. We now have thousands of profile drawings available. There is no lack of profile drawings. The big risk now is that we look at a sherd and it basically matches the first profile we find. And so we say, okay, that's what this thing is. But if you look at this slide that includes material from recent excavations at Methone, not far from Thessaloniki, those are the ones in the middle of the slide. In the lower left is a profile drawing from Monakov's work of two amphoras from the Black Sea that he identifies as Chian. I sort of looked at that and thought, okay, what is the actual evidence for these being Chian? They have stripes. Clazomenian amphoras have stripes. Probably a lot of amphoras in the early 7th century had stripes. And so we have to be careful not to assume that the limited number of types that have been defined over the last century or so of amphora studies are the only ones that are there. And Marek very importantly highlighted this point in his paper this morning, that there are a lot of gaps still to be filled in. Likewise with the Methone publication, which again appeared in 2012, Methone 1, Volume 1, it was a fantastically important publication because it showed us this range of what amphoras of the late 8th and early 7th century looked like that we had never seen before, certainly not in that quantity. And again, the real risk is to kind of be complacent and say, okay, if this sort of looks like something we know, that must be what it is. So there's certainly much more work still to be done. We do, though, have a much better, I think, broad typological framework for analysis. So, for example, if one is working on mushroom-rimmed amphoras from Priene, for example, you're not going to, I would not advise comparing those fabrics to the North Aegean or comparing those fabrics to, say, the Adriatic, because those regions, if they did ever produce a mushroom-rimmed amphora, it was a one-shot thing that somebody then hit that potter really hard saying, never make that again, you know, make what we do here. We don't do those. That's what those Southerners do. And so we now have, I think, we're starting to have anyways, a kind of typological framework that can get into this sort of discussion with archaeometry. In terms of chronological challenges, obviously these still remain. There's been huge progress. Gerald Finkelstein's work on Rhodian amphoras in the early 1990s, and through to his publication of his book in 2001, kind of set a certain expectation that we really should be able to pinpoint these jars on an annual basis. We should be able to say this eponym goes with this year. That's probably an unrealistic expectation in some ways, but that's what people are kind of expecting and working with now. I would say that the same needs are now felt in terms of all the other stamped amphora types out there. We need to create based on local histories, based on stratified finds. We need to start thinking about what are the chronological implications of all the many, many other stamp types that are out there. And I just show you on the slide some examples from Troy of a late Hellenistic type that we can in fact pin down again very narrowly in date, again, just because of the local history. There is, though, much more to be done, obviously, in terms of amphora chronology, in terms of unstamped amphoras. And again, this will depend very, very heavily on stratified studies and local histories. One of the biggest issues to arise in the conference in Bonn and Cologne, in fact, primarily in some of the one of the keynote lectures in Cologne, was the idea that Greek archaeology is at least 40 years behind Roman archaeology when it comes to quantification and economic studies. And I think, yes, that's in part true. But we're also dealing with a problematic data set. We're in many cases dealing with what I refer to as legacy data, so material from old excavations. And I show you here them workers in the mid-1950s stacking the context pottery in the basement of the Stoa of Attalus for the first time. They basically filled the Stoa. As soon as they built the basement of the Stoa as the storeroom for the excavations in 1956 when it was completed, they filled it. So they had no more room. to make room, they had to throw out the amphoras and other coursewares and planewares. So we are dealing with edited material. The result being that we have to be very careful about how we use quantification and the kinds of questions that we ask of those numbers in order that we might talk about them, or we might say, are there other questions that we might better answer that don't have to do so much with quantity, but have more to do with quality? And that's been my, my general approach. Related to that is a continuing need to pay attention to the nature of our assemblages. And this is often has to be very selective because a lot of the material we excavate is not that useful in terms of assemblage studies. But what you see on the screen here are some graphs that compare settlement distribution of amphoras on the site of Panayırdag, which is the possibly, very likely, classical Ephesus, comparing the settlement distributions with material from a very small, very steeply set sanctuary of Meter on at the same site. And this is work that I carried out with Irene Kovalek, who was studying all the other pottery. I was doing the amphoras. And some interesting distinctions arose between the settlement and the sanctuary. In the sanctuary, there's far less local amphoras, whereas in the settlement, the local amphoras are relatively common. The other thing that we found was that the sanctuary tended to only have little tiny sherds, whereas the settlement had tiny and big, the whole spectrum. So there are these kinds of distinctions among assemblages that I think are very worth thinking about. Now, in terms of what I mean by qualitative studies, it's really this question of how did people do business? And this is an area where this trend in economic historian work towards embracing what's referred to as new institutional economics, focused very much on the issue of transaction costs, is something that I've been thinking about actually long before people started talking about new institutional economics. The issue of what commercial information is carried by an amphora, by the physical amphora itself. What could a buyer take from that jar? Likewise, how would the jar obscure information or trick a buyer? And I think there's a lot more that can be done in this regard. Another thing that I've kind of tinkered with a bit with my colleague Sean Graham is simulations of network interaction aimed at explaining why different areas seem to share shapes of amphoras and certain areas do not share their shapes. So how we actually transmit ideas about shape is another aspect that we can learn from the artifacts themselves. Before I wrap up, I want to close with what might be a kind of radical suggestion for the future. One of the conversation topics that came up when I was a PhD student, and I imagine this still comes up, is why are we doing this? Why are we studying ancient pottery when the world is changing so rapidly on such a large scale? When polar bears are dying in the Canadian Arctic, suddenly things about amphoras really tend to pale in comparison as American nuclear missiles head towards North Korea, and I'm thinking, okay, is this a Chian amphora? Okay. I think, my fellow graduate students all kind of said, yeah, what we're doing is useless. And I thought, no, it's not. My answer to that was, I'm trying to tell people that there is no necessarily natural way to behave, whether it's in economics or other aspects of life. So I hope that I'm contributing that in terms of amphoras and trade. I'm saying there are different ways that people have interacted over the centuries, and we need to learn about that. We need to think about alternatives to what seems like the only possible natural way to engage in exchange. So one thing that, as I was thinking about, okay, well, how can we, are we still doing that? You know, am I still raising these kinds of questions? I hope I am. One of the questions related to that, though, is what I think of as a kind of trend in Amphora studies. We tend to really focus on what we could consider, I think, the ancient 1%, the super rich, the people who could afford massive cargoes, the people who could afford massive farms that, you know, cranked out enough wine to fill thousands upon thousands of amphoras per year coming out of roads. We tend to think of, you know, the magistrates, the upper crust whose names appear on these amphoras. We don't think about the guy schlepping the amphora over there, or we don't think about when you move from minimal amphora production on the island of Rhodes in the classical period, if any, to suddenly dominating the Mediterranean with your maritime exports, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of amphoras. Who's filling those things? Who has changed from being basically a gardener to being a guy whose life is working on a farm to crank out the necessary grapes to fill those amphoras? Who has changed their lives to be, you know, doing being a shoemaker, to retraining as a potter, because suddenly you need thousands of potters on the island to crank out that number of amphoras that were needed every day. I don't know how we study this. I have no idea. But I think we have to. I think we need to think about the broader implications of the kinds of things we're studying. In closing, I just want to highlight this passage that I heard actually on Canadian Broadcasting Corporation radio not long ago. If there's any reason for us to be artists at all today, and I would include in artists Amphora scholars, we are artists, it's to be the bringers of doubt. This is what you need to do. Bring doubt. Thank you.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much for this lecture. I think everybody enjoyed it very much. Thank you for this walk through research history, for this view on former research questions, and for the view into possible future. So I would like to open up the discussion.
I have a personal question. Have you ever met Professor Burker? Christoph Burker?
Yes. Yes.
He's here.
Oh, yes.
I just have to explain. The reason why I ask is because two of the progress in the field were mentioned by by Mark without giving the name, and I had some doubts if you ever met. So Professor Burker is with us.
I said his name. We met at a Skillis conference in 1996, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Otherwise, it's very interesting what you said at the end, but they didn't have trade unions at that time. So how can we know, except for potters, I think Mark will agree with me, except from stamps, we are most likely the secondary stamps on Rhodian amphora are understood as being those of potters in certain conditions who actually made the amphoras. And except that, quickly, I don't know how we can study them as amphorologists. Maybe if you study local material, coarse, as we call it, coarse material, or an historian, and I don't know, I have no idea now coming to my mind, but I guess there are historians who are interested in slaves, garlands, and soldiers, and cheating fish sellers on the market of Athens and so on. So And I love this. I mean, it's not a critic, but I don't know how can we contribute to the story of those people?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know. I don't know. And in a way, I think, what I'm trying to urge is that people think about new questions entirely. It's one thing, yes, we need more people publishing more amphoras. Yeah. But we also need people to be thinking really about, who was using these things? What impact did these things have on people's lives? How did they carry on their day-to-day lives? How was that changed, et cetera? And I think, I think we can address issues of say, scale of production, changing scale of production, and the implications of those changes. We know, for example, that, one thing that would be, I think, very profitable in this regard would be to look at the history of slave revolts on Chios in direct relation to the record of amphora production on that island. I don't know I've never done that, so I don't know what the result would be, but I think it's worth thinking about. And also, thinking about the fact that Italian amphoras, by and large, are sloppy in their construction. The handles and the walls are really thick. The handles are applied really roughly. They're not, the surface isn't smoothed down. Whereas Greek amphoras are sort of way over-engineered and way too carefully done for the most part. And how do we think about that in terms of who's making these things and what value do they place in their handiwork and all kinds of issues like that. So again, it's just I don't know the answer to how we do this, but I think one thing that we need are new questions, and we certainly need debates, because if we don't have debates and new questions, we will not attract students. They will study things that people fight about.
First of all, thank you very much for your lecture, and it's very important to have all this amphora material, because they can bring us a little bit further on social history. For example, the role of women. Now we know from the Rhodian stamps that we have 12 names of women stamping the amphora material, and connected with epigraphical material, we can see what's the role of women in Hellenistic period. That's very important. Thank you.
Well, and the fact that at a number of amphora production sites, they're also producing loom weights. So the place wherever that material was being, if those loom weights are being distributed at the workshop site, as are the amphoras, then you've got perhaps a certain amount of interaction there, between men and women. There's the issue of women's names on stamps. There's the fact that women's names appear on certain types of stamps, but not on that many. Not that many cities have women on their stamps. So whoever these women are in terms of their roles in Rhodian society is different from women's roles in other city-states. And this reminds us that there is no single, the status or the role of women in ancient Greece, that it did vary from place to place.
Well, I think I can give a reason to work on amphoras, because this is what I'm doing. Actually, I'm not an amphorologist. I just had to study the Rhodian amphoras simply because there were 95% of the imports in Israel, and I wanted to first check the chronology. And it happens that I had a good idea because I changed it, and so far it's still valuable. And that I can already say that it may last for a while. And the only reason I was interested in amphora and stamps, it's for history. And actually, if you look at my articles, it's two-folded. I mean, using context, what we usually do, context with termini to date amphoras, and not only amphora stamps, but types of amphoras. And on the other end, I'm using, and I used, and it still happens now, amphora stamps to date historical events. So I personally think that it's completely linked with history. History of trade. In some phases, for example, it seems that the fabricants come from high society. There is Nathan Badou who is trying to show this also for roads. I mean, we can study history and, to a certain extent, society. So, and for example, I had the chance to be interested in an area which was very badly studied for the Hellenistic period. You had the Persian period, which was before Alexander's, then the Hasmonean period, because it was local. But when I started, almost nothing was said about the history and archaeology of the Hellenistic period. And there were those thousands of amphoras that were found a century before that were not properly studied. So if you work on a specific region or city, amphora can help understanding the history of the city in the sense of sociological and historical as events are concerned. So I think that's a good reason.
Yeah, John. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, of course, also for this brilliant lecture. And I think that your ideas for the study of the future is very something that we should keep in mind. And it reminded me at this recent IAC conference in Bonn and Cologne, which had to do with the archaeology of ancient economy. There were, as far as I can recall, perhaps I'm wrong, but as far as I can recall, there were no papers or no session on slavery, which I think is surprising because everybody would agree that slavery has played a big role to the ancient economy. But as Cheryl also pointed out, perhaps, and you did yourself, perhaps it will be difficult to study the lower side of the amphora, used in antiquity, but it would be worth trying. But I wonder if it could be also profitable to study in more detail the consumers of amphora, because at least we have the find spots of the amphorae, and perhaps they could tell us a little bit more, especially if we're dealing with cities that have been destroyed, Olympus, for instance, or Pompeii, and etc., and other places as well. Perhaps we can get some more clues about who were actually buying these amphorae and who how they were, the function that they had in really had in society. Because as I think I said earlier, I hardly think that if you wanted to have a glass of wine for your meal in the evenings, you wouldn't go out and buy 26 liters of wine. That would be a bit excessive. So I think that could also be another venue for future studies. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yeah, I think that's very important in what you say, John. The more we can pay attention to exactly where amphoras are found at a given site, rather than, again, the more traditional approach, which would be simply saying, here are the amphoras from Troy or Gordion or what have you. It becomes, I think, again, it's much more interesting in terms of figuring out how people lived in antiquity, which is why we're here. It's much more interesting to sort out, the distribution of amphoras around a site, if there are patterns in that. Again, really the article that I've written that I'm sort of most happy about is one that dealing with the graffiti in the southeast corner of the Agora, where there's this clear pattern that despite 3 articles and 1 complete Agora volume on the graffiti in Da Pinti from the site, no one had commented on. You know, that they'd studied a lot of this material, but every time I opened a box of sherds that I knew was from that quadrant of the Agora, I would find more unpublished graffiti in there. I could count on it, but nowhere else in the Agora. And so, yeah, the more we put the archaeology with the amphoras, then we can start answering these questions. And I do think that, yeah, that we need to continually integrate issues of economic history, of social history, into this archaeological study. We're not here just to draw sherds, though that can be very calming, fun. But one other thing I want to say in terms of what you were just saying, John, I mean, in terms of IAC, I do worry that in the current, or not, well, yeah, in the current economic climate, not just the climate, but the nature of economic history right now is very positive, especially in relation to the ancient world. A lot of very, very good scholars are pointing out that the ancient economy, ancient economic behavior, economic standards of living, et cetera, was pretty good. And I worry that we're getting a little too sort of rosy and, you know, rose-colored glasses in our look back at antiquity. And I worry that this is a sort of phenomenon shaped by our own current existence. That, you know, either that we want something better than what we're in, so we look to the antiquity for something calmer, better. But, you know, you think about the real debates over the nature of the ancient economy and, say, starting in the 60s and 70s and 80s with Karl Polanyi and Moses Finley and these guys, and that's not the start, I know, but when things were really, you know, raging. This was obviously a time of much economic uncertainty and questions about the nature of economies in the modern world. And I fear that we're not questioning modern economies maybe enough. And we need to think about the ancient economy in that regard again as well.
Thank you for that very interesting talk, which for a non-amphora specialist was also very interesting to listen to. And forgive me if this is a question out of ignorance, or somewhat ignorance, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on these more qualitative research questions that you mentioned as a sort of a future perspective on the field, and what you would say were the most pressing groups of material that should be addressed?
Well, I think one recent trend that I didn't mention in the talk that I probably should have spent more time on or spent some time on is the issue of capacity and standardization. And this is something that I know a lot of European scholars now are really focused on, trying to get a sense of the nature of standardization across multiple centuries and across vast territories. And why this comes down to a qualitative issue is that if you are buying an amphora in the Agora, and you don't know how much you're getting, but the guy selling it to you knows exactly how much you're getting, then this is an asymmetry of information. And you as the buyer are at a distinct disadvantage. Now, all economic transactions bring some kind of lack of similar asymmetry. But what interests me in terms of the nature, so this idea of qualitative research, the question then arises, how has that asymmetry changed over time? Are there certain time periods where people could be pretty confident of what they were getting in a jar or in a group of jars? And are there certain times when they'd really have to have already established a good relationship with the seller so that they'd be confident making that purchase? And so these are the kinds of questions I think we can be asking, and that we can answer even with the not so great archaeological record that we have to deal with in the Aegean world, where you've got sherds being thrown away because of lack of storage space or what have you. We can still use the evidence from the sherds themselves themselves, nothing else, just from the sherds themselves, to talk about issues of information exchange, of transaction costs, exactly the kinds of things that economic historians are interested in right now. So we as Amphora people can make, I think, very substantive contributions now to current debates in economic history. And that's what we, again, this is what I think we need to be doing.
If no one is having another question, I would like to have one.
Yeah.
I like very much what you said on local amphora production, because normally when you say amphora, you think of transport, amphora, of export. And so Pergamon was never known for producing any kind of export, transport amphora, but we found amphora, definite amphoras, obviously locally produced because they have not found somewhere else. And so they are made for the internal transport of goods. That's something which I think it's very important to stress always, because normally people are only looking for export.
Well, and export can take, of course, many forms. I mean, if you have, say, a vineyard 40 kilometers from Pergamon, or 20 kilometers from Pergamon, yeah, you want to get your goods up to the city. And so, again, you still need amphoras. Whether they're going to actually get into a ship and go somewhere else is a wholly other matter. What's really striking, though, is that at many, many sites, not Athens, because after around 500 or 490, 480 BC, as far as I can see, Athens was not producing transport amphoras. But other sites, pretty much every other site I've worked at any rate, you look at the assemblage, and there's one type that is there, is dominant. And you think, okay, well, this is either produced at this very site, or it's within, a few tens of kilometers. I mean, it's local. I'm not saying, I never say that city necessarily. But this is certainly true at Troy. If you look at the material at Archaic Miletus, for example, it's almost all Milesian, in general terms. Same at Cladzomina. I mean, I think it's very common. Now, to the extent to which this is true, say, in the, say, late Roman Aegean, I think is an interesting question, and that still, it's not, I don't work in that period at all, so I can't really say, but even this pattern that I'm seeing is something that could easily change, from period and place to place.
Okay, so if there are no other questions, I would like to thank you, Mark, again for your lecture.
Yeah.